Today, which may or may not be the 19th of July, we're looking at the third chapter of the book of Ruth. And this chapter is actually concerning Ruth herself. Let's look at the book as a whole. If you could sum up Ruth, the book, how would you word it in one sentence? How about kindness will be rewarded and God's providence? God will provide for all. And if you wanted to sum it up in one word, the word for the day would be hesed, the notion, the idea of loving kindness. So this is a story of how loving kindness is shown by people rather than by God, although God provides for people through the actions of the participants. Perhaps when you first read Ruth, maybe as a child, it sounded like a fairy tale. It was a story of a young woman, Ruth, who puts herself at the mercy of others. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, and her kinsman, Boaz. And through their advice and their actions, she is saved from poverty, starvation, isolation, victimization. Ruth is rescued. And all live happily ever after. And the story ends with Ruth married and having a child. Of course, in biblical times, names were important. So let's look at the names of the main participants and what those names mean. Naomi means pleasantness. Well, she was so pleasant that both her daughters-in-law initially wanted to stay with her when they were both widowed. And how about Boaz? Boaz means strength is within him. And Boaz shows himself to be a successful farmer, a man who is able to look at all the relevant information and consider carefully his options before making decisions. And Ruth, what does Ruth mean? Well, Ruth means friend. Have you ever met a Ruth that you wouldn't want to be friends with? Have you ever met a Ruth who isn't kind and loving? I had an Auntie Ruth who was the Sunday school teacher and gave off such a wonderful aura of kindness, gentility, love for everybody. And I now have a niece called Ruth. She's a carer, and she too shows affection to so many people in so many ways, both practical and emotional. There's not many names that are so tied up with the meaning of the name that they have an opposite, but Ruth is one of them. So, for instance, there's no such word as Grahamless or Emmaless or Annless, but there is a ruthless. And what does a ruthless person demonstrate? A ruthless person shows no pity, no compassion. They're harsh, they're cruel, and they will do absolutely anything to achieve their goal. The idea that a ruthless person will do whatever it takes is interesting, because the story of Ruth can be seen as a fairy tale, but as with most fairy tales, it can be read with a far darker side, and it could be seen that many of the participants in this story actually have a ruthless streak in them. How about the modern phrase coercive control? Is that demonstrated in this chapter? Well, I think you could say it is. Can we see it in some of the relationships within the book? For instance, is Naomi exerting coercive control over Ruth when she advises her what to do? Is Ruth doing the same to Boaz when she lies at his feet on the threshing floor? Or is Boaz doing the same when he says to Ruth that she should be offered to a nearer kinsman? It was a different time. They had different cultures, different laws, but the same issues. Women, and poor people generally, but it tended to be women, were allowed to glean. But they all knew that they were placing themselves in a certain amount of danger, and that danger was from sexual assault. After all, Boaz tells his overseer to ensure that Ruth is not molested. And of course, biblical times, slavery was the norm. Now we have modern slavery. Was Ruth being treated as a slave? She was certainly a chattel. Naomi knew that her own welfare depended on the ability to ensure that Ruth got for them both the access to food, to shelter, security, and long-term safety, and that the only way that that could be achieved was by marriage to a man of means. On first reading, the story is also about generosity. That word hesed, loving kindness. We see the love Ruth has for her mother-in-law, the kindness Boaz shows when ensuring Ruth can glean and making sure she's fed and given access to extra food. But we also see streaks of discrimination. The story deals with issues current then and now, diversity and discrimination. Naomi knew that Ruth was her best asset, her best way to provide for future security. But they both also knew that as a foreigner, Ruth would not be as easy to marry off. The laws about marrying outside of a faith or marrying people from other places were developing. There were traditions to consider, the economics, the prejudices, which all came into play. And even today, we still need to think of our colonial background. Look at the Windrush scandal, and then more recently, the murder of George Floyd and murders closer to home, to know that there is still a need to stand up and say, Black Lives Matter. As already described, Ruth is a fairy story or a dark tale of coercive control, depending on your interpretation, your experience, your willingness to see the nuanced words. It's also a celebration of people's generosity, as well as a warning about discrimination and unfairness. Looking at chapter 3, it's also a story about people taking responsibility for themselves, or it's a story about leaving decisions to other people, free choice versus predestination. We see within chapter 3 that there are 3 occasions on which decisions are left in the hands of others. In verse 4, Naomi tells Ruth to lie down at the feet of Boaz and, quote, he will tell you what to do. And Ruth agrees, both that she will do as Naomi suggests and then follow the lead that Boaz takes. Later, in verse 13, Boaz, when talking of another kinsman, says to Ruth, remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do it. If he's not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning. Again, Ruth submits to the decision and instructions of Boaz. Finally, the next morning, Ruth returns to Naomi and explains what happened and is told, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Once more, Ruth takes the route of compliance and is willing to do as Naomi suggests. She waits to hear whether she's to be married to Boaz or another relation of her husband's. To allow others to dictate a person's future to this degree seems strange to us. I certainly would never dream of trying to tell my daughter what to do or how to run her life. But this is a story demonstrating hesed, loving kindness, and God's providence. Ruth trusts that people will do what is best for her. She shows that she can act calmly when required, accept decisions that are made, and of course in the final chapter we hear that she marries Boaz and is blessed with a child. And as nothing is coincidence where the Bible is concerned, we would do well to remember that Boaz is a descendant of Rahab, the prostitute, who saved Joshua and Caleb when they entered Jericho, and that through the marriage to Boaz and birth of a child, she, Ruth, becomes the great-grandmother of David the forefather of Jesus. Life might be easier if it was black and white. If this story was a simple fairy tale with no dark issues, no conflicts, no grey areas around what may or may not have happened that night on the threshing floor between Ruth and Boaz. Who, here's some questions, who may have been manipulating who? Who, if anyone, was a vassal being subordinate to another? And can you justify thinking that all parties concerned were acting for the benefit solely of other people, intentionally or otherwise? But context and nuance is what makes life interesting. It's why Woodrow Wilson must be seen as a person with faults and prejudices, as a person who, yes, instigated the League of Nations, which went on to be the UN, but also reinstated segregation in America. Ruth's story comes at a time in the Bible when there was a period of disobedience, idolatry, and violence. It had messages for the people who lived 2,000 years ago and has messages for us today. What that message is for each of us will depend on the people we are, our willingness to deal with the complexities of life, to make decisions, or to accept that some decisions are taken out of our hands. Personally, I like to think of the people in the book of Ruth as I think of the characters in the film Pretty Woman. The film is a fairy tale story about a prostitute who a rich businessman falls in love with. He offers her the chance to be a kept woman. She refuses and decides to get herself back on the road to self-respect and independence. The businessman eventually goes to see her, proposes marriage, and the film ends with him saying, "So what happened when he climbs up and rescues her?" And she replies, "She rescues him right back." The word for today, hesed, or loving kindness. The giving of kindness is returned with more loving kindness by the people concerned, and God provides for all of them, as he does for all of us. As we offer loving kindness and accept loving kindness, let us never forget to thank God for what he has provided and accept that some decisions have to be left to others. Amen.